right. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. First and foremost, I put the link there in the chat box, but just by way of demonstration, in case anyone can't find it, the concept of education in Islam, Al-Attas, PDF, and you will find it, first one. Okay, so it should be pretty easy to find. I'm going to bring up my PDF version here, and then we'll go from there. So, as a disclaimer, so I sat down. I sat down and I was trying to kind of, how should I say? I was trying to like take notes and summarize and figure out, you know, how can I really make this easier for us to go through, and so that we don't have to read it word by word. Although, as many of you know, I'm kind of a proponent of the reading it word by word method, but nonetheless, I thought I would try to facilitate things a little bit. So I sat down, I was taking my notes diligently, and got like my couple pages done, my notes, drew some like charts, trying to help and stuff. And then I got to the point where I was like, you know, we really just need to read this thing word by word because it's not, how do I say, like there's different kinds of readings, right? Like some of them are pretty straightforward. You can kind of read it, you get it. And so it's easier to kind of summarize and pick pieces out and so on. But some of them are kind of like more deeply philosophical. And if it's more deeply philosophical, then kind of like it's written in a way where each sentence builds on the one before it. So if you cut pieces out, that has consequences. And then on top of it, you just kind of miss things. However, it's also one of those readings where when I sat down and I took notes with it, it helped me a lot. So we'll go through this and inshallah we'll take our time with it as is necessary. But I would encourage, like in the in-between, if people have the chance during the week, to kind of like go back and read it and think about it, sit with it a little bit. If you have the opportunity to do so, I think that would be beneficial. Not because of don't go back and listen to the video. Go back and read the paper, because it's what he's saying that's really, really important and foundational. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's just begin. With that, let's begin. The concept of education in Islam, Syed Muhammad Naquib Al-Attas. Syed Naquib Al-Attas is, without exaggeration, one of the central kind of like philosophers and thinkers of Islam in the modern world. So this whole kind of like, people may have heard of this Islamization of knowledge project that had different branches. That stems from him in Southeast Asia, Malaysia in particular, but of course in Indonesia and other places as well. And spread to the US under the work of IIIT, International International Institute of Islamic Thought. I think 3 I's and a T. They've published a lot of good stuff. And, you know, Dr. Taha Jabir, Allah yarhamu, and the others that worked with them. But Sayyid Naquib Al-Attas is like, kind of like the big shot, in a sense, of the metaphysical and philosophical kind of like thinking through how do we build a framework for ourselves that's based on our tradition and comes from our tradition, and then we use that as a means by which we approach the various types of knowledge that exist around us. Now, critiques of the Islamicization of knowledge project aside, he is without a doubt an extremely profound and important thinker in our period, and I believe that you will notice that when we read this, inshallah. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the concept of education in Islam. قال المؤلف حفظه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله وإياه بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Allah preserve him and give him increase. He's still with us, and he's quite aged, mashallah, but he's still with us. I want to, before we begin, point out, if you notice here, that this copyright is for 1980. And this was an address that he delivered in 1977. And the reason why I think that is important is because oftentimes you'll hear these kind of like conversations in the Muslim community that are sort of like, you know, nobody thinks about these things. How come nobody ever talked about this? These kind of conversations. And, you know, just because we haven't heard it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And just because we're not familiar with it doesn't mean that it hasn't been there. Like, this is 1977. That's almost half a century ago now. Like, subhanAllah, when you think about it, that's a good 43 years ago now. You know, that's a long time. And it seems like for someone who's born in the 80s, which makes that kind of like my reference point, it just keeps getting further and further back, right? Like, in my mind, the 80s, the 90s are close. But in reality, all of these times are, a lot has passed. So anyways, we'll go on. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Concept of education in Islam. The meaning of education and of what it involves is of utmost importance in the formulation of a system of education and its implementation. So the first thing that comes up here is we cannot proceed in general without addressing the issue of meaning. No matter what we're doing, we cannot proceed without addressing the issue of meaning. We cannot proceed without addressing the issue of intention, right? Because to ask the question of meaning is also to ask the question of intention, right? Like, what are we doing this for? And what is it attached to? And what does that mean? What does that do for us? So this is the first issue. Nothing can be taken just because. And of course, like, we engage with the world, we deal with the world, but we should think. We should question, we should think. And it's like one of the big things you often hear is this whole thing about technology. That technology is a tool. You know, don't be mad at the phone, don't be mad at the internet, don't do this, don't do that, this platform, that platform, because these are just tools and you can use tools however you want. It's true, you can use tools however you want, but there are philosophical and cultural and societal implications to the introduction of particular types of tools. So there are philosophical questions that come in relation to these things. It's not as simple as just, oh, you know, use it for good or use it for bad. It's not a shovel. Like, and even a shovel is going to have consequences. A wheel is going to have consequences. And one of the not so long and yet still really good writings on that, I don't know if I have it at arm's length here or not, it might be at home, is Technopoly by Neil Postman. Technopoly by Neil Postman. And kind of like this development of the way that we engage technology. Do we engage it as a tool, or do we at some point become a tool of that technology in some ways? Another work that I haven't personally read, but I've heard recommended a lot, is called The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul, who was a French philosopher, if I'm not mistaken. That's here somewhere too, but I don't know where it is now. To show it to you. That one's fatter, and it's a lot more involved of a reading. But in any case, the point is we have to ask the question of meaning. Supposing I am asked, what is education? And I answer, education is a process of instilling something into human beings. Okay, so this is a possible answer. Education is a process of instilling something into human beings. In this answer, a process of instilling refers to the method and system by which what is called education is gradually imparted. Something refers to the content of what is instilled, and human beings refer to the recipient of both the process and the content. So what part of what he's doing here is, and it shows you which framework he's functioning from, is this is generally the way that our scholars would do things. If we're going to say what is something, and then we give some sort of definition of it. When we give some sort of definition of it, we don't just leave the words that are used in the definition to be left by themselves. We have to actually even define the words that are used in the definition to make sure that we're all on the same page about this whole thing. And that's what, like, we'll see this tomorrow, actually, when we get into the introduction to Islamic law and ethics. I'm not going to do what some of the shuyukh do, which they spend like an hour and a half just on the definition of fiqh. You know, what is fiqh? It's you know, this type of knowledge that's derived. And it's like, we're not going to spend that long on it, but you'll see that each word has to be understood in and of itself in order to move forward. So he's defining the parts of this. Now, the answer given above already encompasses the three fundamental elements that constitute education. So three fundamental elements that constitute education: the process, the content, and the recipient. The process, the content, and the recipient. But it is not yet a definition because those elements are deliberately left vague. So we haven't actually defined them yet, so it hasn't come to being a full definition. Furthermore, the way of formulating the sentence meant to be developed into a definition as given above gives the impression that what is emphasized is the process. So depending on how you structure the words in the sentence, it's going to put the emphasis in a particular place, right? So if he puts this as education is a process of instilling something into human beings, the emphasis in that statement then becomes about the process. Emphasis becomes about the process, right? Whereas maybe we don't want it to be formulated in that way. You know, maybe we want to formulate it in a different way. So here's a possible different way. Supposing I reformulate the answer, education is something progressively instilled into man. Now here we still encompass the three fundamental elements inherent in education, but the order of precedence as to the important element that constitutes education is now the content and not the process. So now it's something that's progressively instilled into man. It's about that something. So let us consider this last formulation and proceed in analyzing the inherent concepts. Okay, so now he's going to work from this point. To give you a, what are those called? Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert in this context, inshallah, will help. But this is a spoiler alert. Education is something progressively instilled into man. This is the initial starting point he's going to start from. But as he works through each piece of that, this is going to turn into a paragraph, basically. And that paragraph then is going to be transposed onto the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, "Adabani Rabbi fa ahsana ta'dibi," which is a disputed hadith in terms of authenticity, but it's not disputed in terms of, like, all of the scholars will quote this hadith as something that is important to our worldview. And that can be translated as, "My Lord educated me, and in doing so, he gave me an excellent education." Adabani Rabbi fa ahsana ta'dibi, but involved is the word adab, which we'll come to. Part of this also that you're going to see as we go through this is that as I've kind of mentioned before, one of the things that is extremely important to Islamic studies is the Arabic language. And sometimes we can figure out like how native or foreign a concept is to our tradition by trying to figure out how would we even translate this to classical Arabic, or how would this be understood in classical Arabic if it's a modern Arabic term. very interesting in this regard, and we're not going to go off on this topic right now, but is the question of the word Islami or Islamiyun. What does that mean? And how was it used in the early period of Islam? And how is it used today? And it's very interesting. But we'll see in this paper as he goes through that a lot of the terms are Arabic terms, and he's working with them in English, and he's kind of translating them and trying to figure out how we work with them. And so doing, at the end, he'll conclude and he'll say, in this discourse, basically, we dealt with these terms, this one and 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 this one, and all of these are essential to a conceptualization of how we look at learning in Islam. Okay, so education is something progressively instilled into man. Man, obviously, he doesn't even address that here because 40 years ago it was a different landscape than it is today, but man includes woman, just like mankind includes womankind, humankind. And maybe the wording is, people tend towards a different usage now. There may be philosophical consequences to that. We don't need to go into that right now, but when he says man, he means human beings, okay? But he's using it for, he's not actually using it as rajul, I don't think, as a translation of rajul. I think he's using it as a translation of insan. Because later on he's going to say that the man is hayawanun natiq. And usually that's how you hear it in Arabic, is that al-insan hayawanun natiq. Al-insan hayawanun natiq, right? So, So Batul, it's going to come, because every single piece of this is going to be defined. So what he means by education, what he means by something will be defined, and all of those possible issues will be kind of sifted out, so to speak. Yeah, for the people who are coming late, I shouldn't say it that way. For the people who are joining perhaps after the beginning of the class, just search for the concept of education in Islam and you'll find it. Or the link is there sent by Chaplain Sundus. I think when you come after a message has been sent, you don't see the ones that came before. So some people are missing the link. Okay, now here we still encompass the 3 fundamental elements. We said that, and it focuses on content, and let's move forward. I shall begin with man, since the definition of man is already generally well known, and that is that he is a rational animal. Hayawanun natiq. It's the translation of hayawanun natiq. By the way, even though a lot of this stuff is in Arabic, there is actually a significant overlap in terms and usages because of the proximity of Islamic civilization to Western civilization. And an important read in that regard would be this one. Probably can't see it because it's small in the top, but the case for Islamo-Christian civilization, and the light is hitting it funny. The case for Islamo-Christian civilization by Richard Bullitt, professor at Columbia. Case for Islamo-Christian civilization. So like one of the things he says in there is basically that like if you're gonna argue for the idea of a Judeo-Christian civilization, you should really actually argue for the conceptualization of an Islamo-Christian civilization, because the Muslims and the Christians were so close for so much of the history, and there's so much overlap and usage of terms and ideas that came from the ancient Greeks and so on and so forth. Yes, Anthony, this is going to come too. This is going to come too. So the Muslims will call the human being hayawanun natiq, a rational animal, from very early. I can't tell you exactly when, but from very early, like for sure before the Enlightenment, because 400 years ago for us is like nothing. These are things that we're having. You could find this in all like middle period text. You'll for sure find this, which is all 600-700 years ago. But it's going to come right now in a second. So he is a rational animal. Since rationality defines man, we must at least have some idea as to what rational means. And we all agree that it refers to reason. However, in Western intellectual history, the concept of ratio has undergone much controversy and has become, at least from the Muslim point of view, problematic, for it has gradually become separated from the intellect or intellectus in the process of secularization of ideas that coursed through the history of Western thought since the period of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So basically, this concept has changed over the course of Western thought. The idea of what does it mean to have reason, whereas in the ancient Western thought, you'll have this idea that reason and intellect are linked to each other. And this is actually very much closer to the Islamic understanding of the idea of aql, which he's going to say right now. Muslim thinkers did not conceive of what is understood as ratio as something separate from what is understood as intellectus. They conceived the aql as an organic unity of both ratio and intellectus. Bearing this in mind, the Muslims defined man as hayawan natiq, where the term natiq signifies rational. Okay, so actually, I'm not going to say anything because it's going to come. I'm going to delay it coming if I say anything. Just try to follow the argument. Man is possessed of an inner faculty that formulates meaning. So man, by definition, has this faculty. That faculty formulates meaning, and that is what makes them natiq. That is what makes the human being dhu nutq, an entity that has this capacity of formulating meaning. And this formulation of meaning, which involves judgment and discrimination and clarification, and of course, discrimination here, people, is not like hating on others, right? When you teach kids, you realize that like sometimes words get misunderstood in totally different ways. Discrimination, like being able to mayyiz, to distinguish one thing from another. So involves formulation of meaning inherently involves judgment, discrimination, clarification, and that's what constitutes this rationality the human being is endowed with. The terms natiq and nutq are derived from a root that conveys the basic meaning of speech in the sense of human speech, so that they both signify a certain power and capacity in man to articulate words in meaningful pattern. So again, part of this definition then of being rational is tied, especially in the Arabic usage, is tied to the idea of speech itself and the ability to articulate words in a meaningful way, in a way that makes sense, to bring them together, and so on. So the human being is, as it were, a language animal, and the articulation of linguistic symbols into meaningful patterns is no other than the onward, visible, and audible expression of the inner unseen reality which we call aql. So there's an inner reality which is the aql, this nexus, so to speak, or this point, this capacity that exists between the mind and the heart, in a sense, or the brain and the heart, or however these terms all become difficult to work with. But it is the faculty by which we understand. And it is not simply a physical thing, but it is also a spiritual thing, which will also come. And that's inside of us. And the speech that we use is the expression of that. So it's the reflection of that it's to bring that into the seen, in a sense. Whereas before it's spoken, it exists in this unseen. The term aql itself basically signifies a kind of binding or withholding. So that in this respect, so this is also one of the meanings of the word in Arabic, aql. It's the same word actually that's used in everyone's favorite hadith about tawakkul. That you tie the camel, aqilha, that you do aql of the camel, and then you rely on Allah, right? This idea of tawakkul, as you tie your camel and you rely on Allah. The word that's used to talk about tying the camel in the Arabic expression of the hadith is the same root as aql. So there's a meaning there also of tying things together, holding them, binding them. As a side point, sometimes Like if things aren't fully coming together immediately, it's kind of similar to the hikam. Remember when we were first reading the hikam, there's certain things like you hear them and you're like, I'm not sure I really get that. And over time, when you sit with it, you sit with it, you sit with it, and we go through more of the hikam, more of the hikam. By the end of it, inshallah, I hope some of that becomes more understood. Sometimes with these kind of works and papers, we have to kind of like sit with it a little bit, and it clarifies with time, inshallah. If you're struggling with it, just try to be patient. But mashallah, most of the people here, I probably struggle with it more than you all will. So, so that in this respect, the aql signifies an innate property that binds and withholds objects of knowledge by means of words. Aql is synonymous with qalb in the same way as qalb, which is a spiritual organ of cognition called the heart, is synonymous with aql. And his reference here is Lisan al-Arab, which is like the famous dictionary of the Arabic language. So he's saying that this aql actually and the qalb, they're synonymous. So what is the aql? It's usually what happens with the Muslims too now is because we're living in whose atmosphere of words and ideas and concepts are we living in? Usually for many of us, no matter where we came from, oftentimes we're still living in the framework of the West because of globalization, because of domination, because of all these other things. So even now when the Muslims use aql, they don't usually think of qalb, right? Like the average Muslim that speaks Arabic, if you talk to them about their aql, you tell them, even if they're not Arabic speaking, if they're like Farsi speaking, I know Farsi speaking people use aql. I don't know if they use it, if it's used in Turkish or not. But like they'll say, do you have some aql? This person has no aql, for example. And they'll use it, but usually it's referring to the mind. But we have to understand that in our framework, this cognition is a cognition that happens at several different levels. And one of those levels is at the spiritual level. Okay. Let me just mute for a second. So this is the heart. The heart is the spiritual, it's a spiritual organ of cognition. Okay. The real nature of the aql is that it is a spiritual substance by which the rational soul, and nafs al-natiqa, recognizes and distinguishes truth from falsehood. So we have this nafs natiqa, the rational soul exists there. The aql is a spiritual substance, capacity, a means by which this nafs of ours that reasons begins to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Okay. It is clear from this and many more references which we have not mentioned that the reality underlying the definition of man is this spiritual substance, which is indicated by everyone when he says I. So yeah, interesting comments in the chat box. Yeah, I think all of those things are going to come together, inshallah. So what he's getting at is when he says, so when we refer then to I, we're not just referring to like a physical sack of flesh. We're referring to something that goes beyond that, some sort of understanding, some sort of spiritual capacity, right? So he says, when we speak of education, therefore, it must pertain to this reality of man and not simply to his body and his animal aspect. It must not only be like some superficial type of learning. A superficial type of learning we cannot consider to be true education, which is what he's going to work on as we move forward. In defining man as a rational animal, where we mean by rational the capacity for understanding speech and the power responsible for the formulation of meaning, which involves judgment, discrimination, distinction, and clarification, and which has to do with the articulation of words or expressions in meaningful pattern. The meaning of meaning in our present context, and based on the concept ma'na, is the recognition of the place of anything in a system. So now he's saying like, okay, the rational animal deals with the formulation of meaning. So what do we mean by meaning, right? This is now the next step. What do we mean by meaning then? What is ma'na? What is ma'na? Is the recognition of the place of anything in a system. So similar to how in the beginning, as I said, he's starting with this kind of very broad definition of what is education, and then throughout it, it's going to get fleshed out. What he's starting with here in terms of meaning is also very broad, and it's going to get fleshed out. So the meaning is the recognition of the place of anything in a system. So this is where he's functioning from. The recognition of the place of anything in a system. Such recognition occurs when the relation a thing has with other things in the system becomes clarified and understood. The relation describes a certain order. So if we're going to talk about meaning, we have to talk about relationships. And if we're and those relationships existing in a system. And that if we're going to talk about relationships within a system, then that entails an understanding of the idea of order. Okay. Meaning, conceived in the way I have formulated above, is a mental image in which a word or expression is applied to denote it. So we have this again, this relationship between things in this system that has some sort of order, and a word or expression is used to denote this thing. And when that word or expression becomes an idea or a notion in the mind, in the aql, it is called mafhum. So this is some sort of thing that's understood. It's a concept, something that's understood. This part we're not going to spend too much time on because how should I say? Some things are like, I shouldn't say. I'm going to say we're probably not going to spend that much time on it, but we'll see how it goes. So you see this development. We're talking about meaning now. As an intelligible form that is formed in answer to the question, what is it? It is called essence, mahiyya. So now we're talking about this understanding of a concept or an idea, something that's understood. In answer to what is it, it's called an essence. Because you can, one of the things that happens, I'm assuming this happens in philosophy, I haven't really studied, I just know how the Muslims talk about these things, for better or for worse. You have to go to Shaykh Fuad for the real kind of like analysis of these things. I messaged him actually when I was reading this part, and I was like, like, can you help me with this? Because I don't want to get this wrong. But there's some subtleties to it. And I'm not really the person probably to get into it. So what is the difference between mahiyya and that? Because that they will also oftentimes translate as essence. I'm assuming that's part of where this question is coming from. What is the difference between mahiyya and that? My impression, I don't know if Ustad Honest has maybe some insights on this as well. Just by way of, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Honest, but mashallah, the brother has completed a degree in Sharia from Al-Azhar. So, he may have some insight on these things, as well as other courses of study and so on. So my impression, just kind of thinking out loud right now, and again, like this is the kind of thing that would be parsed a lot more in a lot more detail in the world of kalam. And as a Sharia person, my kalam is weak. That's where Shaykh Fuad comes in. But unfortunately, my Sharia is weak too. But, this happens, I guess. Mahiyya and that feels to me more abstract. Because it's usually, like oftentimes when we use that as well in reference to essence, it's referring to Allah. And mahiyya is not necessarily about Allah. If we're trying to get at the essence of a created thing, we say mahiya. But when we're talking about the essence of Allah, we use that. And perhaps there's some sort of abstractness that's left in that, right? The mahiya, maybe we're kind of trying to understand it and define it, and we can't define it when it comes to Allah. So we need a term that's more abstract and not a term that's related to defining. And we need a term that will refer to the essence without engaging in any sort of epistemic closure, to use a term that Dr. Omar uses sometimes, which is an amazing term, epistemic closure. But I hope that helps a little bit. So they'll use that for mahiya. Considered, because, so now what he's getting at here is min haythu. Min haythu. In Arabic, when they say, and hukum min haythu this is this, hukum min haythu this is this, that when you take a concept and you look at it from different angles, you'll see different things. And so if we look at it from the perspective of the question of what is it, it is called an essence. If we look at it from the perspective of something that exists outside of the mind, that is objectively, it is called reality, haqiqa. Or if it's being looked at as a specific reality distinguished from others, it is called a huwiyya, an individuality or an individual existence. In this way, and in the context of the present discussion, we say that what constitutes meaning, or the definition of meaning, is. So now he's saying, based on all this, here's the definition of meaning that we're come to. Is recognition of the place of anything in a system which occurs when the relation a thing has with others in the system becomes clarified and understood. So he's again talking about the system, but this relationship has to be clarified and understood. And he's going to go into more. We say further that the relation describes a certain order. Is huwiyya like subjectivity? I don't know. I don't know that. Huwiyya in modern Arabic is used for, what is it? Identity? Identity, I think, is the word they use for it in modern Arabic. It's like, so I think that's probably where there's an individuality to it. I don't know if it could be translated that way or not. Maybe. Again, the problem with me sometimes on these things is I don't know the corresponding, I don't have the English around some of it. Sometimes I don't have the Arabic either, but I definitely don't have the English. It's like grammar. Someone asked me grammar, I'm like, I have no idea what that is in grammar. I know what it is in Arabic, but I don't know how you say that in English. Even now, I'm like I'm trying to teach English to my son because he's being homeschooled, and I'm like, I don't know what an adverb is. And then I started thinking about it. I was like, oh, it adds to the meaning of the verb. This is crazy. Like, I'm like learning things in his English book now that I never really realized. Alhamdulillah. In this way, and in the context of the present discussion, we say that what constitutes meaning, or the definition of meaning, is recognition of the place of anything in a system, which occurs when the relation a thing has with others in the system becomes clarified and understood. We say further that the relation describes a certain order. This to me was a really interesting paragraph, because in some kind of like trends of thinking, and our community is not safe from this either, there's like, and sometimes these are responses, like there's a subjectivity that becomes so rampant that you can't really define anything. And sometimes that's a response to like an objectivity gone wild, in a sense of like things were made to be more certain than they actually were, and so there's a space there and people are rebelling against it, so on and so forth. But the point is, in the end, like if we can't attribute meaning to anything, if there's no sort of like objective way of thinking about things, if there's no sort of objective way of defining things, of engaging with things, of thinking that something is right versus something else is wrong, then everything kind of crumbles. And that's what he's saying. That's what he kind of gets at in this portion right here, which I'll just read straight, which I thought was very interesting. For example, like one of the things that will be very common now is kind of like being against the idea of hierarchy. And sometimes you can understand where that response comes from, right? Like rigid hierarchy that's used to oppress or abuse other people then becomes something that people want to reject, right? So it comes from somewhere. But then when you lose hierarchy, you kind of lose like everything. Um, I've had cases with kids where you're like trying to teach them something and they're like, well, this doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't, like, why are we even learning this in the first place? And you're kind of like, that's what I'm here to tell you. Like, I am the teacher, you are the student. That is what I am here to share with you. Inshallah, by the end of it, there will be some sort of understanding on this. Gone, like, and I'm talking about between like 10-year-olds and adults. I'm not talking about the majlis, right? Like, I don't look at it that way in these kind of gatherings. In these kind of gatherings, it's more of like a community of learners learning together, So I don't mean that here. If everything in a system were in the same place, so if there's no order, right? You have a system, but there's no order in the system. If everything in any system were in the same place, then there could be no recognition. There could be no meaning, since there would be no relational criteria to judge, discriminate, distinguish, and clarify. Indeed, there would be no system. For recognition to be possible, there must be specific difference. There must be essential relation. And moreover, these must remain. For if the difference and the relation were not abiding, but were in a state of constant change, specifically and essentially, then recognition of things would be impossible, and meaning would perish. And this brief outline has already revealed the intrinsic connection between meaning and knowledge. You can't, like, it just all goes away. I felt this way about it, and I felt this way about it, and I felt this way about it. Alhamdulillah. I saw a dream of this, I saw a dream of this, I saw a dream of this, I saw a dream of this. Okay, alhamdulillah. In the end, we have a sharia. We have a sharia, and we don't reject that there are sometimes realities that kind of are like supra meaning, or they don't work in the same way as all these other things, but yet there has to be something that's foundational that we all are going to agree upon. The word has to have a meaning. There has to be, like, you can't just be like, everyone gets to make it up for themselves. Like, tell someone, hey, pass the salt, and they give you the pepper. And you're like, oh, I asked for the salt. And they're like, well, yeah, I gave you the salt. Like, I call that salt. I call that pepper. Like, what are you gonna do? But why must they remain? Doesn't language change? Why must they remain? Doesn't language change? So later on, he's going to talk about this idea of how the word is not about the word in and of itself, but it's about the relationship with the word and the meaning. It's part of why the meaning thing comes up here. And they're connected. And so what's actually the issue is the meaning. The meaning has to have some sort of, there has to be some sort of what's the words that are used here? Constancy to the meaning. But this is an idea. Maybe the word that's used to explain it will change, and it will change in a way that everyone understands from it that meaning now. But it also might change in a way that everyone, like we just talked about with the aql, it might change in a way that now, although it's the same word, it's referring to a different meaning. And so we have to ask the question of, what is this connected to? And are we talking about the same thing? So it's not necessarily that the language can't change, but the relationship between the language and what it indicates, we have to think about this indication. And if this indication can just be completely haphazard or subject to never-ending change and so on and so forth, then it will be, by the way, Batul here, I don't know if you finished now or not, but she's got to be close by now to finishing her PhD in linguistics. So, you know, language change happens within some boundaries. The system remains, but each element changes in a certain boundary. Maybe there is a well-defined limit to change. Yeah. So like I said, there's some of these ideas, he's touching upon them, and even, you know, these are lecture notes in the end. So it's not going to be like a full fleshed out discourse. I wonder if there's something, there's probably like more detailed works that he's written on it, but in any case, let's keep moving with it for now. Okay, so this is man. This is all talking about man, right? The second important element inherent in education is its content, which is here indicated as something. Which is here indicated as something. A lot of names that we haven't seen in a while, by the way, are with us tonight. And it's really good to have you back. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah. There's no judgment in that. There's no judgment in that. People come, people go, people have things that they go. Some things are more interesting to people, some things are less interesting to people, some things are a higher priority, some things are a less higher priority. No problem. All I'm saying is it's good to see you. The second important element inherent in education is its content, which is here indicated as something. In that first definition, something. This is done deliberately because even though we all know that it must refer to knowledge, we have still to determine what we mean by it. So we know when we're talking about education that we're talking about knowledge, but he leaves it as something on purpose to force us to have this deeper conversation over what knowledge actually is, okay? The teaching and learning of skills alone, teaching and learning of skills alone, however scientific, and no matter if what is taught and learned is encompassed in the general concept knowledge, does not necessarily constitute education. So he means something very particular by education, and we mean something actually, the concept of education in Islam, we mean something very particular by that. You know, we don't, and that's what's going to come at, by the end, that becomes clear. But to just like learn how to paint a fence, so there's nothing wrong with painting a fence. I just been watching YouTube videos on it, so that's why I'm talking. That's why it comes to mind first. Learning how to paint a fence, we don't necessarily call it education, right? But if the person engages, for example, with the idea of painting a fence and the various meanings that could be associated with that, and how those tie into larger concepts, and the things that can be learned about how they develop and discipline themselves through painting the fence. Like if you paint the fence the way that the sensei in Karate Kid teaches them to paint the fence, now this could be called education. But if we're talking about just, you know, you put one coat on and then you put a second coat on, we wouldn't call that education, right? So this is where it's getting into a little bit more of the fine-tuning. The teaching and learning of the human, natural, and applied sciences alone does not constitute education in the sense we are clarifying. Human, natural, applied sciences. There is a something in knowledge which if it is not inculcated, will not make its teaching and learning and assimilation in education. But there's something in this knowledge that if it's not there, it's not education. What is this something? Most of the rest of the thing keeps coming back to this something. In fact, the something that we allude to here is itself knowledge. So this something that we need in the seeking of knowledge is a certain knowledge. What is it? Indeed, it is knowledge of the purpose of seeking it. At this point, we are compelled to ask, what then is knowledge? Or what does knowledge consist of? So this something is the purpose behind all of it. Something is the purpose behind all of it. Which you'll see how kind of like the ideas of ilm and amal and niyyah, all of them start like working their way into how he's describing these things. In the beginning, I referred to the fact in accordance with Islamic tradition, we understand, in the beginning, I referred to the fact that in accordance with Islamic tradition, we understand definition as of two types. So when you study again in the realm of Islamic studies, they'll always talk about you have an had and you have a rasm. These are two different ways of defining things, which is studied in the field of mantiq and logic. So there's definition by had and definition by rasm. By the former is meant a precise or concise specification of the distinctive characteristic of a thing, and by the latter is meant a description of the nature of a thing. So these are two different ways of defining something. One of them is a definition that has to be jami' mani'. It has to be precise and distinctive. Has to include everything that would make it unique, and at the same time not allow other things to come in. So it has to really only refer to this thing. Sometimes you can't do that with certain things, which he's going to say here. This distinction reveals that there are things which we can define specifically to its precise distinctive characteristic, such as in the case of the definition of man, because he said man is hayawanun natiq. This is a precise, concise, distinctive definition. A human being is a rational animal. No other animals are involved, and this is the capacity of the human being that is truly distinctive. And there are things which we cannot so define, but can define only by describing its nature. Knowledge comes under this latter category. So we can't define knowledge in the same way that we defined man. We have to define it in a way by which we describe its nature. We describe its nature. Something that comes to mind here is the definition of the word tasawwuf. Tasawwuf, Islamic spirituality, Sufism, whatever you want to call it. You guys, we've had this conversation enough times that I hope I don't have to shy away from the usage of a word that is part of our tradition within certain boundaries. So tasawwuf, it has like a million definitions. Everyone gives it a different definition. Why? Because you can't give it a definition according to the first category. You can only give it a definition according to the second category, wherein you describe its nature. And all these people, these masters of tasawwuf, are describing then something that relates to their own experience in a sense, right there. So they have all these different ways of describing it. It is to be honest with Allah and good to the creation. It is to turn truly to Allah and nothing else. It is to do this. It is to do this. There's all kinds of different definitions because it falls into this category, but he's going to try to do this with knowledge now. It's 8:05. Okay, let's see. There are many definitions describing the nature of knowledge, but what is of relevance here is the epistemological definition, since it is important to understand what the Islamic epistemological context involves and implies. So we're talking about concept of education in Islam. So we want to learn we want to look at knowledge from the perspective of our sources. Okay, Perhaps its greatest implication lies in its effect upon our vision of reality and truth, and our methodology of research, our intellectual scope and practical application in planning for what is called development, which all bear upon our understanding of education. So how do we look at knowledge? And this is something that's often discussed in the very beginning of our works on theology, ilm al-kalam, especially as it becomes developed. And I think for those of you who probably attended way in the beginning of when we started our in-person classes, when Shaykh Fuad taught Sughra Sughra of Imam al-Sanusi, I'm sure he went into a lot of this in the beginning of, like, what is the hukum? Okay, we talk about the hukum as aqli and adi and shar'i. What are the different types of judgments we have? We have intellect-based judgments, we have sharia-based judgments, we have observation-based judgments. What does that say about our worldview then? That means these are the three places we take knowledge from. We take knowledge from pure intellect, we take knowledge from revelation, and we take knowledge from observed reality, right? So these are part of the epistemological approach of our worldview. He probably also spoke about it at length, I would imagine, in the whole class on getting our minds right. In any case, Muslims are in concerted agreement that all knowledge comes from God. Like, if you're a Muslim, you kind of have to agree on that. It's very difficult to challenge that one. If you believe in the Quran, believe in Allah, believe that knowledge comes from God. And He is an alim, alim, that above anyone or anything that has knowledge, there is one who is alim, there's one who is more knowledgeable. And we also know that the manner of its arrival and the faculties and senses that receive and interpret it are distinctly not the same. So all knowledge comes from God, whether that be from revelation, whether that be from the world, whether that's from the book of Allah that is seen or the book of Allah that is read. Kitabullah al-Manzur wa Kitabullah al-Maqru, the book of Allah that is read, the Quran, or the book of Allah that is seen, which is the created world. All of that's coming from Allah. However, the manner of its arrival and the faculties and senses that receive and interpret it are not the same. Okay? Since all knowledge comes from God and is interpreted by the soul through its spiritual and physical faculties, it follows that the most suitable definition would be that knowledge with reference to God as being its origin is the following. So, all knowledge comes from God and is interpreted through the soul, spiritual and physical faculties of the soul. Okay, so again, that qalb aql issue, soul is being used here as well. With reference to God and with reference to the soul as the interpreter. So now he's in min haythu, this one, from this perspective, from this perspective. From the perspective of God as being its origin, it is the arrival in the soul of the meaning of a thing or an object of knowledge. The arrival in the soul of the meaning of a thing or an object of knowledge. And that with reference to the soul as being its interpreter, knowledge is the arrival of the soul at the meaning of a thing or an object of knowledge. But it's an arrival of meaning of a thing or an object. We have said earlier, and now there's like a little juxtaposition here between the revelation and the observed world, which I think is pretty cool. But we have to stop somewhere. Ideally, we stop here. But that's 2 pages from now. These are not 2 light pages. Let's see, maybe there'll be a reasonable place to stop in here. Yeah. 6 minutes. I know we have till 8:15, but 6 minutes is not very long for 2 pages. We spent an hour so far on probably 4, 3, maybe 5, because the first 2 pages aren't really anything. Anyways, let's see. I would understand it here as aql, to Anthony's question. But I could be wrong. I feel like it's aql. We have said earlier that the world of nature, as depicted in the glorious Quran, is like a great open book, and every detail therein, encompassing the farthest horizons and our very selves, is like a word in that great book that speaks to man about its author. So the words of the Quran speak to man about its author, and the words of the great open book speak to man about its author. Now the word as it really is a sign, a symbol, and to know it as it really is to know what it stands for, what it symbolizes, what it means. To study the word as word, regarding it as if it had an independent reality of its own, is to miss the real point of studying it. For regarded as such, it is no longer a sign or a symbol, as it is being made to point to itself, which is not what it really is. And this is a big issue with like Islamic philosophy and where Western philosophy went. And the reductionism that came as a result of that. So the reductionism of it is to say that the word is just a word. It doesn't have a meaning underneath it. The object is just an object. It doesn't have a meaning underneath it. Take the substance out of it. Substance, take the substance away. So it becomes materialistic, it becomes superficial. It becomes the world, rather than existing horizontally and vertically, because if you have substance, if you have meaning, there's a horizontal world you experience and there's realities to it, up and down. There's ontological realities up and down of the created world. Like we talked about the mulk and the malakut in the hikam class, the idea of the physical world and the spiritual world and the archetypical world that kind of is another layer in the vertical realm. But the reductionism will take away all of that. And now all we have is what we observe. And so if we were to like write a theology text for the modern world, it would say that أقسام الحكم واحد. الحكم العادي. Like for us, we say أقسام الحكم ثلاثة. حكم عادي, حكم عقلي, حكم شرعي. For us, we have 3 types of rulings. Again, we have the Sharia ruling, comes from revelation. We have the intellect ruling, and then we can have the ruling that comes from observation. You might have some debate on the second one in the modern period, but like generally speaking, we have the observable world. And that's why you can give a khutbah and talk about the heart, and afterwards, and this happened to me, someone will come up to you and say, I don't know why you're talking about the heart all the time. You know, I'm a doctor, I study the heart. The heart is just a piece of flesh. You're like, wow, subhanAllah. Like our scholars, they studied the heart too. Like that piece of flesh that you studied, they studied that one too. Razi, who was the philosopher, who was the mufassir, who was the theologian, he was also a physician. Like these people were not, like, were they that dumb? Like, really? Do you think they were that dumb? Or subhanAllah, the nafs. And that's why the nafs is part of this whole process of making meaning and coming to conclusions and so on and so forth. So in like manner is the study of nature, of anything, any object of knowledge and creation, pursued in order to attain knowledge of it. If the expression as it really is taken to mean its alleged independent reality, essentially and existentially, as if it were something ultimate and subsistent, then such study is devoid of real purpose, and the purpose of knowledge becomes a deviation from the truth, which necessarily puts into question the validity of such knowledge. For as it really is, a thing or an object of knowledge is other than what it is, and that other is what it means. So just as the study of words as words leads to deviation from the real truth underlying them, in the same way the preoccupation in philosophy with things as things leads to the erroneous, ordinary level of experienced belief in the existence of their alleged essences outside the mind, whereas in reality the so-called essences are only mentally posited. A thing, like a word, is in reality ultimately a sign or a symbol that is apparent and is inseparable from another thing not equally apparent, that is apparent and is inseparable from another thing not equally apparent, in such wise that when the former is perceived, the other, which cannot be perceived and which is of one predicament as the former, is known. So what is it saying? It's saying when you have the relationship between the thing and the meaning is such that when one is perceived, one is apparent and one is perceivable, and it is inseparable from the meaning, which is not apparent, but is perceivable by way of that apparent thing, okay, which is this form. What we have outlined is in fact a summary exposition of the Quranic concept of ayah as referring to words and things. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Like when he gives us, you're like, wow, wow. This is what it means for something to be an ayah, for something to be a sign. And this is why the poet said, the line of poetry we always quote, and it's always quoted in Islamic studies, أَلَا فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ آيَةٌ تُدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ. أَلَا فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ آيَةٌ تُدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ. In everything there is a sign that indicates that he is one. In everything there is a sign that indicates that he is one. There is a meaning beneath that sign that takes us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think it's okay actually to read this page quickly and finish. The meaning of a thing, no. That is why we have defined knowledge epistemologically as the arrival in the soul of the meaning of a thing, or the arrival of the soul at the meaning of a thing. The meaning of a thing means the right meaning of it. And what is considered to be the right meaning is in this context determined by the Islamic vision of reality and truth as projected by the Quranic conceptual system. So it's not a free-for-all, what is right and what is wrong. It is projected, this is a vision of reality and truth that is projected by the Quran. We can argue over some of the details and the conclusions and so on and so forth, but the Quran is the guide in this regard. And it takes it a step further. We may now recall our earlier reference to the relevance obtained between tafsir and ta'wil as valid methods of approach to knowledge and scientific methodology respecting our study and interpretation of the world of nature and its significance in our conception of knowledge and education. I'll comment after I read the whole part. In the same way that tafsir and ta'wil apply to the glorious Quran involving its entire conceptual system, its reflected meanings in the hadith and sunnah and in the things of the empirical world, so is the book of the world of nature to be interpreted by scientific methods emulating those of tafsir and ta'wil, treating the things of the empirical world as words, as signs and symbols operating in a network of conceptual relations that all together describe an organic unity reflecting the noble Quran itself. This is a lot. So he's saying, again, we have the book that is seen, we have the book that is read. The book that is read, we have methodologies for dealing with it. And those methodologies that we use to approach the language that is used in the Quran are methodologies that allow for the flexibility that is inherent in language within certain circumstances and contexts, while at the same time acknowledging that this is part of a system, right? The Quran represents a system of ideas and concepts and knowledge in a sense. And so when we understand the words of the Quran, we understand them within that context. And so there are Tafsir and ta'wil. Tafsir is usually like, because to get into this would require some usul fiqh. Probably won't get into right now because we're already over time. But basically, you have a word and it has possible meanings, but one of them is very much more possible and more apparent, and it is mufassar in a sense. It is a tafsir. This is a clear meaning. There are possible other meanings in theory, but in the context of this conceptual world, this is the one, and it is apparent. The other possibility in ta'wil is that like it's not as apparent immediately, but within the context, it becomes a stronger interpretation of what the word means. We might have to come back to this next time. Maybe next time we'll start with, maybe I'll try to pull the passage from the usul book on tafsir and ta'wil. But this is not tafsir like in the Quranic sense, like in the tafsir of the Quran sense. It's tafsir in the sense of like the linguistic sense. But basically what it's getting at is that we have a body of information and we have a piece that's inside that body. And that piece inside that body sometimes, now we take that piece. That piece has possible meanings. And inside that conceptual world, it will go different ways based on what's there, right? Whereas if you put it in a different conceptual world, it might mean something else. Anyways, what he's saying is that this method that we use to interpret the Quran, which is very interesting, how the Muslims developed this in terms of linguistics and how to look at the Quran and stuff. We have to have similar methodologies that are, that emulate those of tafsir and ta'wil, treating the things of the empirical world as words, as signs and symbols operating in a network of conceptual relations that altogether describe an organic unity reflecting the noble Quran itself. Because these are both word of Allah. So the Quran has its methods and it has its vision. And the world has its methods and it has its vision. And they should reflect each other because their source is one and the same. And so this is kind of like what he's hinting at here. In this way, also, the noble Quran is the final authority that confirms the truth in our rational and empirical investigations. This is also why, in the Quran, in a sense, the Quran is more straightforward. It's more direct than the interpreted world. If you say, like the interpreted world is kind of like a ta'wil, our conclusions there, and the Quran is the tafsir. It's clear. So the Quran is the arbiter in all of this. What we are saying is that knowledge, as referring to meaning, consists of the recognition of the proper places of things in the order of creation, such that it leads to the recognition of the proper place of God in the order of being and existence. This is the conclusion of that section. Some of you are like nodding and shaking your heads. I sent some pieces as I was preparing to my wife, and the only emoji that works for it is the one where the brain just explodes. You're like, wow. So what we are saying is that knowledge, as referring to meaning, consists of the recognition of the proper places of things in the order of creation, such that it leads to the recognition of the proper place of God in the order of being and existence. So we'll probably pick up from this page next time and like review it a little bit, take questions, stuff like that. Come back to it, but try to read it, try to review these couple pages we covered on your own. I think it will help to kind of sit with it and read it a little bit. Also, as a spoiler alert, you can see where this is headed in terms of the idea of adab. And in our current situation, adab has been made into like manners, etiquette. Adab has been made into, and it's broader than that, as we'll get into, but it's been made into this thing that like doesn't really matter. But it actually encompasses the essence of a lot of what we're about. And so edeb is about recognition of the proper places of things in the order of creation, such that it leads to the recognition of the proper place of God in the order of being in existence. That's part of it. So, there's a lot that's it's amazing, subhanAllah, when you start like going through it, because you see how, like, sometimes we take a piece and we feel like that's a little bit strange, or I don't really get that. And then when you start really kind of like, you see there is like a symphony to it. There is a way that, like, the Muslims, when we approached learning and we approached knowledge, and we had the tension that we had between one another in the approach of knowledge and learning and so on and so forth, there is like a congruence that comes from that. And when we start to leave that foundation and approach everything without a recognition and acknowledgement of that foundation, we become very incongruent. And this is, I think, one of the major challenges that we have intellectually. And sometimes people are like, oh, this is just intellectual stuff, who cares, whatever. And I'm like that a little bit sometimes. I get like this kind of like farmer tendency in me, where I'm like, forget it, just like plant some seeds and fish. Who cares about these things? But there are psychological consequences. If we want to bring it to like a very immediate for people's lives, there are psychological consequences to incongruence. And when we don't understand these things properly, when we don't understand our religion properly, when we're taking from all these different places, when we're coming to conclusions that are not based on sound reasoning, when the Muslim way combines between sound reasoning, combines between observation and experience, combines between the guiding light of revelation to create an integrated and congruent way of dealing with the world. That has a consequence on the individual, has a consequence on the inside of the person, has a consequence on the outside of the person, on the family, on the society, and so on. Allah give us tawfiq. If you guys want to share anything or engage or share any reflections and stuff, let me make it so you can unmute yourselves. And we can engage with that if you like. And if you need to go or something, you're of course free to go. So, bismillah.
Shaykh, may I ask a question? Or
Absolutely.
First off,
I'm leaving this on Spotlight View, guys, not because I don't want to see you, but because I don't want you to get shown on YouTube without your wanting it. So your voice, if you ask a question, your voice will be on YouTube, but not your image. Inshallah.
First off, Jazakallah khair for picking this. I actually, I guess you might say like philosophy is kind of like an intellectual hobby of mine. So I actually really appreciate this. One of the things I noticed about his approach thus far is that I guess it's congruent with traditional I guess Christian, Jewish, and Muslim ethics that is very Aristotelian, and the basis of it seems to revolve around this idea called teleology, which is essentially like the purpose of things. Like things have a purpose, and I guess the problem that it's not the problem that I have is as someone who's gone through the academy and the sciences, it's like you aren't allowed to consider teleology. It's not something that's in the current paradigm. And I guess what I'm wondering is, and I don't know that you necessarily have the answer because I don't, or if anybody else does, is like how does one how can we have a Muslim sort of inspired uh, species of education when like the basis of it, which is that things have a telos, like they have a purpose, like you aren't really even allowed to sort of consider that in the dominant paradigm, like you're just not, right? Like you can, like things are usually thought about mechanistically, which I guess is like the hukam adi, like mechanistic. I guess that's like kind of scientific inductive, I suppose, is how I might translate that. Like, but you like you can't say that you can't talk about purpose when you do science, at least in the academy, like you just can't, right? So like
After post enlightenment.
yeah, post enlightenment, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's probably where, like, if you're going to engage people that are coming from that perspective, you know, like when we're, for example, when he's writing this, he's assuming you believe in the Quran, right? Like there's an assumption at some level that the person who's reading this believes in the Quran, and obviously that has its consequences. But if you're dealing with someone who's not, or who doesn't, I should say, then you know I guess the approach differs. Maybe you have to go back. You have to go back to like.
Yeah, I mean, like, because when I think about stuff like climate change, like I almost directly link that to not considering like the purpose of certain things,
Mm,
right? Like maybe we're not supposed to cut down all the forests in the like in the world, right? Maybe that's not the purpose that we're supposed
right,
to be pursuing, right?
right.
Um, but with I believe it was actually Francis Bacon as like the one most responsible for that. So I guess the question is like, you know, I'm a Muslim, so I believe in the Quran, but like I guess the civilization that I'm in theory a part of isn't the dominant one. It's not the one ruling the world, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So how do we navigate that? As particularly as like someone who's like in the academy or has gone through the academy or like whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure other people have thoughts on that. If anyone else has thoughts on that, you're welcome to share it. I think that's an important question. But I think kind of like what you just said is interesting, and I think that part of the challenge sometimes is that it needs to be approached from multiple angles. So like, say for example, people aren't willing to engage this idea of telos or of purpose, and it goes back to Bacon, which I'm not so well versed in. You're more well versed in that stuff. So say it goes back to Bacon. Well, then maybe part of it is that we're gonna re-engage that conversation. That's part of it, but part of it is to also show that there's consequences to these ideas that are also observable. So, like you said about climate change, like you said about there's other issues as well. Certain there's probably other areas where we could look and say, look, this is what happens when you reduce this thing in this way, and you know, you can have your position, but we can have our position too, right? You have lakum civilizationukum walana civilization. We and you know.
Because I guess it would be different if you had like in theory, I guess a Muslim civilization that was there's sort of a parity between that and I guess the kind of mechanistic secular or whatever. But like, like you said at the outset, like I guess we're subjugated, I suppose. Like not even just in this country, but like I mean, presumably like even intellectually, like elsewhere, right? I mean, like the Western paradigm, like is the dominant one. So it's like he's talking about, like there's a meaning behind the words, but while you were reading it, I'm thinking like I don't even know that people actually believe that anymore. They actually probably like don't, which is might be part of the problem.
Right.
So
Right.
how do we? It seems like the task would be to like re-engage that conversation, but is it one of those things where like you can't really turn back the clock? That's kind of the. I mean, you might maybe disagree with me on with this, but like I don't. It's not that I think the traditional view is wrong per se, but I don't know how you and I don't know how you get people to 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 reconsider like a question that's considered old, like to go backward, because like that's usually the like when you read it, some sort of secular philosophers, usually that's the line that they say. It's like we know this is a problem, but we can't go back to like where we were because that's regressing, right? We can't go back to this idea of like, oh, maybe things do have meaning. Maybe there is such a thing as balance. Maybe there is such a thing as like telos. It's kind of like we can't go back to those quote unquote myths that we used to like believe in, as if what we believe now isn't myth. As if what we
Right.
believe isn't myth. So
I mean, and that's what I would be kind of like. So why can't you go back to that? Well, because we had this intellectual enlightenment that led to the industrial revolution, and that's like what brought us to the modern world. So, like, because so what's underpinning that is that no matter whatever we came to later is better because of evolution.
Yeah, I mean that's like basically
So
sort of.
yeah, so
Yeah.
but I mean, like, how can you say that it's better? Yeah, some things maybe are better, but can you just automatically say that everything is better? Like the native peoples didn't have wisdom in the way that they dealt with the earth. Are we just gonna like throw that out? Um, and I mean, like, we don't have a great track record for the last the last 150 years. Like, we don't really have a great track record. It's not. Yeah, there's tragedies that happened before too, but it's not. That's the point, right? Like, there's tragedies that happened before. There's tragedies that happen now. So what makes now? Like, here, we're sitting here at the brink of the destruction of our species, potentially. Yeah, and uh, like, so, but we can't reevaluate some of these questions. I mean, that's I don't know. Lakum dinukum waliya din. In the end, lakum dinukum waliya din. You have your way, I have my way.
Yeah, except when their way burns us all. burns us.
It burns us all. So what do you have to eat? So yeah, and I think so. Like, a practical thing is, you have to create alternatives. And the problem is that it used to be probably a lot more plausible to create an alternative, whereas now, like, the globalization is all enveloping. It's really difficult to create an alternative now. And but that's what these people were worried about, like the Islamization of knowledge, this whole project of how do we deal with this now, because we can't escape it. That's the part of the problem with Islamic economics, right? Is that you can't escape the world economy. Like, in the past, you could have you can have Darul Islam, and you can have rules that regulate your Darul Islam, and it's going to be its own system, and it's going to be fine. And you're going to have different rules when you go to other people's lands, but you can't escape, like, the world economy and its consequences. And these are the hard questions.
Anyway, thank you, Shaykh.
Barakallahu fikum. It's always fun. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Uncle Charlie, Syed, a lot of brilliant people, mashallah, here right now. So I feel like this group of people, we could sit and engage these things for like a day, and it would be good. No? Type, alhamdulillah. Then inshallah we'll meet again next week. And may our hearts and our minds be guided and be illuminated and enlightened, and enjoy the wonderful blessings of Allah, and the blessing of being able to know Allah. Alhamdulillah. Ameen. Barakallahu fikum. Subhanakum bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.